All right, Todd Granger, good morning. Great. Okay. So I think that because folks are putting their introductions in the chat, I'm going to assume that you can continue to hear me, and I know that my screen is up, so let's officially get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our introductory webinar for the school indoor air quality programs. We are really excited to finally be having this webinar and launching these programs. We have two programs to talk about today. We'll be getting into the details there. Before we do that, I will introduce myself. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jody Lesko. I'm the Director of Programs and Implementation for Efficiency Vermont, and it has been my great privilege to be a part of the school indoor air quality programming since June of 2020, and I have met many of you. Some of you will be new to me and to these programs, but I'm really happy to be in this seat again, working with you all. Before I move on, I would like to invite my esteemed colleagues from Efficiency Vermont to turn their cameras on and just say hello and give a wave. We will have opportunities for formal introductions in future webinars, but just so you know that there are a number of people who are working very hard to make these programs easy to participate in and get you the support that you need to improve indoor air quality in your buildings. I certainly do not do this alone. There is a small army of people who I'm working with, and I couldn't be more happy to have the team that I have working with me to support all of you in doing this work. So thank you to my colleagues for being here and for all the work that you've put in getting these programs situated. We also have Jill Briggs Campbell from the Agency of Education, who will give a wave there. Many of you have also met her. She is our esteemed partner at the agency, and she and I have been basically virtually attached at the hip for the last 2 years as we have worked together to execute these programs in really challenging circumstances and navigating I will say, dizzying array of federal rules. And so we would not be here if not for the agency, and I'm very grateful for their partnership. Let's see, so I think we can get started actually. So let's start with our agenda. Actually, I'll start with our objectives. So for me, the objectives today are, and I do see that someone has a hand up, so let me just check who that is. Grant, do you have a question, Grant? If so, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and let us know what your question is.
No, I am very sorry. I'm not sure how that happened, so I took it back down.
It's the mystery hand raise. We've all been there. Okay, thanks, Grant. All right. My objective from my perspective today is to invite participation in indoor air quality programming through Efficiency Vermont. My second objective is to communicate important differences in the programs that we're executing now compared to the ones that you may have participated in the past. As I said, there's sort of a dizzying array of federal rules that we're navigating, and our job really is to make this as simple as possible for you to get the support that you need, both financial and technical. And that is going to require some close coordination and lots of clarity and making sure that we're working really closely with each other and understanding what the rules are, because no one wants to be in a situation where what they thought was going to be eligible ends up not being eligible. And whoops, that was very strange. Did my screen advance while I was talking? Okay, and then it just stopped. So, you know, adventures and virtual meetings. We're used to this now, right? We're old hats. Let's try again. Okay, you can see my slide again. It's always great when these things are recorded too, right? So those of us who will return to this recording or watch it again in the future will get to see that little blooper. Okay, I don't know how that happened, so I guess we'll chalk it up to what Grant's mystery hand raise and my mystery slide advancing. Okay. So our agenda today is I will do a brief indoor air quality programming overview. As I said, there are two programs, a monitoring program and a grant program. We'll talk briefly about both of those, and then we'll dive deeply into the process, particularly around the grant program. We'll talk about next steps, and then there'll be lots and lots and lots of time for Q&A, both during the presentation and we'll save time at the end for that. So we have between now and 9:30, and we can stay longer if need be for whatever questions are coming up. Okay. So let's talk about these two programs. The grant program, which I have said is administered in partnership with the Agency of Education actually last year. So we knew, let me back up a little bit. We knew back in January of 2021 that the program funding that we worked together to execute in 2020 and early 2021 really highlighted continued unmet needs in school buildings, in particular in HVAC systems that are supportive of improved indoor air quality. And so the legislature agreed that this was important work that they wanted to continue to allocate funds to. With the changing landscape of federal funding, the time from when we all agreed this was still necessary to now obviously has been long as we have awaited federal guidance. So thank you for your patience. But it, almost a year ago now, the legislature did approve this $15 million allocation from the ARPA funds, which you'll hear here and there. That's just the acronym for the federal pot of money that this comes from. That money was allocated from the state legislature to the Agency of Education for the Indoor Air Quality Grant Program. So, as I said, we'll talk about a couple of differences, and we'll get into those in these bullet points, but we'll dive in more deeply in the details in the upcoming slides. But prioritization is based on existing conditions. I don't think anyone is under the impression that $15 million will cover all of the needs that we have in upgrading and even installing HVAC systems and mechanical ventilation in this schools in the state. So we need some level of prioritization. We'll get into how we're prioritizing that. It's actually not dissimilar from how we prioritized before, but because we were working so quickly before and because the needs were so great, the prioritization, we can actually take a little bit more time and communicate a little bit more clearly. So we want to do that at the outset this time around. The big difference really is this two-phased approval process. Some of you have already attended some trainings that the Agency of Education started last summer talking about this two-phased approval process. This is really necessitated by these federal guidelines that we're adhering to. We'll get into the details of what that means, but in the past, we were able to approve something at the outset, and you could go on and procure all of your architecture and engineering services, by equipment, all in one fell swoop. This time we have a two-phased approach, and we'll get into those details. And again, we will work together to make this as seamless and clear as possible, but just know that we're learning together, and it is different, and it involves a couple more steps than our previous program. So what hasn't changed is Efficiency Vermont is going to continue to provide technical assistance and execute the subgrant agreements that are supporting these projects. And these construction on these projects must be completed by the end of October in 2024. That will give us a couple of months to wrap up invoicing and payments and do our reporting to the Agency of Education by the end of 2024, which is when our period of performance for this grant program ends. Now, the monitoring program we are administering in partnership with the Vermont Department of Health. We were awarded a grant for ongoing research into what we are recommending, what actions you all are taking in your school buildings, how that's actually impacting the indoor air quality in real time, right? What is going on as you're making these tweaks in your controls, as you're adding more ventilation, as you're doing these upgrades, continuing to understand what is the impact of that in terms of the indoor air quality, and how do we continue to get more refined recommendations based on your space and the specific needs of your space. This is interesting because the Vermont Department of Health is really interested in supporting this work, and they queried stakeholders to understand what the best use of these grant funds would be. And the consensus was that we needed more information to make sure that what we were actually doing in school buildings was having the impact that we want. And if it wasn't, that we had this feedback loop with enhanced monitoring, data visualization, some data analysis, that we had the capacity to do that additional study and refinement. And so that was ultimately the grant that they wrote, and we bid and were awarded that grant, and we're very happy to be partnering with them on that monitoring program. So this will be a smaller subset of schools. This will be, we have funding, we think, for about 50 schools in the monitoring program. There will be monitoring equipment provided, and again, this data visualization and specialized reports based on the information in your building. Technical assistance to hone further HVAC improvements and changes, and also to continue to monitor outcomes. So the timeline for this program is through 2023, but there is an opportunity for 2 12-month extensions, and so it's possible that this research could continue through 2025. We will dig into the details here, but I'm going to move on for now and start talking about the program process. I'm actually going to start with the monitoring process. The grant process is a little bit more complicated, so I want to make sure that we dive deeply into that and I don't lose you before we talk about the monitoring program process. So let's start here. In both programs, the starting point will be what we call the intake form. Some of you have already submitted the intake form. We'll get into exactly what that intake form looks like, but that's basically your entrance into participation in either program, right? That's where you put your hand up and say, I am interested in participating, right? Is an intake form on our website. There'll be a selection process and consultation from by our Efficiency Vermont team with those of you who indicate that you're interested in participating in the monitoring program. There'll be a period of monitor setup. We are doing a bulk purchase of monitoring. We're working with the manufacturers of those monitors now to understand what's going to best meet our needs based on our sort of design criteria and what we want to learn from the monitoring program research. So there'll be a period of monitor setup. Then we'll start to gather and analyze data together, really. Once we get those monitors set up, they'll start to produce some data and reports for us that we would like to dig into and work with you all on. The Efficiency Vermont team will be at the ready to provide technical assistance as we look through that data and those reports. There'll be corrective actions recommended. Some of those might, sort of funnel into the grant program if there are excuse me, grant-funded projects that are recommended out of this. And what I say here in number 7, this is a research project, right? So we continue to do the data gathering, analysis, technical assistance, and corrective actions, right? We're continuing to learn how to get better at doing this work. Okay. And I should also say here that this recording will be available after the fact, and I will also make the slides available. So if you're feverishly writing down notes, I know that I can talk quickly, especially after a couple of cups of coffee early in the morning. Just know that these will be available to you in the future. And as always, the Efficiency Vermont team is here to answer any questions. So you can email us, call us, contact us in whatever way makes sense for you, and we can cover all of this. So our team is definitely on standby to help you navigate all of this. So let's go on to the program process for the grant program. So this is definitely a little bit more detailed. So as I mentioned, the way that you put your hand up and say that you're interested in participating in either one of these programs is through the intake form. This intake form that we have set up, and we're actually going to look at it together, is our initial way of prioritizing the buildings who basically need the most help, right? The way that we are prioritizing, again, similar to how we did before, but the buildings that have the least ventilation, right? The buildings that are two ways that we measure that. Basically, there are some buildings, school buildings in Vermont, that do not currently have any means of mechanical ventilation, right? They don't have any means of drawing outside air in and moving it around their space. So that's one priority, is making sure that every school building has a mechanical ventilation system. Some of you know that your staff and your students show up every day in buildings where there's a heating system, and if they want fresh air, they open the windows. Those are the places where we want to make sure that a mechanical ventilation system is installed. Excuse me. The second way that we're going to prioritize these, or know that something is a priority, is a school building has a mechanical ventilation system, right? They do have a way of mechanically drawing outside air into the building and moving it around the space, but it's either non-functional or nominally functional. It's not adequately serving the square footage where people are in the building, right? So that's another metric for us to look at in terms of how we are prioritizing. So I'm actually going to take us to the intake form because I know that these the questions that are covering like these particular things, I want to make sure that we're all really clear in how we anticipate sort of the information coming to us so that we can make really good decisions about prioritization. So I'm actually going to stop presenting this and we're going to go to the actual intake form. I will share this. All right. Can folks confirm that you're seeing a different screen now? Nodding. Okay, excellent. And I see that there are a couple of questions popping up in the chat. I will definitely get to those. Let me just look now to make sure there isn't any clarifying questions. Yes, great. Thank you for that question, Elizabeth. I'm going to say it out loud for folks that are listening to the recording after the fact. The call for applications went to superintendents. So Elizabeth asks that we make sure that the slides go out to the larger group, including curriculum and grant folks, facilities folks, and business managers. Yes, so we'll work to get these slides out to all of the necessary people. And if you are someone who did not initially receive our email, it was forwarded to you by one of your colleagues, like let us know. You can put your email in the chat. You can let us know after the fact. We want to make sure that everyone who needs to be getting this information is getting this information. Absolutely. Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Okay, so I'm going to look at my other screen over here, which is why I'm not looking at you all. This is the landing page for our school's indoor air quality programming. This is on the Efficiency Vermont homepage. So if you go to efficiencyvermont.com/schools, this is where it will take you. So this basically is the overview of both of the programs that I talked about. And if you scroll down, you can see here that there is this. It's going to take you to this page. And this is basically a questionnaire. Most of these questions are going to be real easy, right? These are not hard questions, but we want to dig into those questions that are a little bit more technical in nature and make sure that we are equipping you all to have the information you need when you go in here. So, name of supervisor, union district, or independent school, the superintendent or head of school. Now, the reason this is different, last time we had the ability to take applications in from your contracted partners, from a variety of different facilities or custodial staff, people in other parts of your school system. This time, again, because we're trying to align really closely with the federal rules that the Agency of Education and we have to follow, we want to streamline it as much as we can. This also, by allowing or by asking superintendents or heads of school to be the submitters, this allows us to get the full picture of a supervisor union or district at once, or a whole campus at once, right? If there's an independent school with a campus. So if all of the buildings that you want to be considered for participation in these programs are captured here, that gives us a full picture of what's going on and the groups of buildings that are under your governance. So submitter name, superintendent or head of school. So this will require close collaboration with facilities folks because some of the information here will likely need to come from the facilities teams. Phone number, email address, a facilities director at the SU or D level, if that's relevant. And then here we get into the school building information, right? So school name, physical and mailing address, facilities manager or custodian name. And then what program do you want to participate in for this building? Grant program, the monitoring program, or both? You can indicate any variety of those here. So here's where we get into the questions I was talking about when I had my slide deck up. Does this building currently have a mechanical ventilation system? Again, if there's a building that has a way to heat and you're opening the windows, that is not a mechanical ventilation system, right? That's what we call heat and windows. For this question, what I want to know is if you have heat and windows in your building, you're going to answer that the building does not have a mechanical ventilation system. All you have is a way to heat, and you can open the windows if you want fresh air. Now, if you have mechanical ventilation, if you have unit ventilators, you have air handling units of any sort, then yes, your building has a mechanical ventilation system on site. Makes sense? I see nods. That's great. Okay. So if you answer yes, there is some version of a mechanical ventilation system in your building. We want to know how well that's serving the square footage of your building, right? Rough numbers. If it's not functional at all, or it's nominally functional, probably 25% or less of your square footage is adequately served by that mechanical ventilation system. Does that make sense? I see nods. Awesome. Thank you. Or if it's only, if you only have unit ventilators or an air handling unit system in one part of your building, right? That's another way to think about it. Like maybe it's working, but it's only installed in a part of your building. There's been an older wing that's never been addressed, whatever it is. So this is really your opportunity to tell us if you have a mechanical ventilation system, but it's not truly serving all of the square footage that it needs to serve adequately, you let us know what that number is. So with the combination of these two questions, this is how we're going to prioritize our rounds of funding. And we'll get into that detail a little bit. But really, if there isn't a mechanical ventilation system installed at all, the legislature has been very clear with us that is a high priority for us for these grant funds. We also agree. We want everyone to be going into these buildings knowing that there's a mechanical ventilation system in place. And if the mechanical ventilation system isn't working adequately or isn't serving all of the square footage in the way that it should, we want to know that too. Those are the ones that are going to rise to the top for our first rounds of funding. And this last question, this is sort of a primer, right? What are the types of things that we typically see as part of a grant-funded project? And we have them listed here. If you don't know, that's okay. We can work with you on that, but this serves two purposes. It tells us generally what you're thinking, right? Do you need an entirely new system? Do you need repairs? Do you need replacements? Have you never had an assessment, or the assessment of your system is so old that it's no longer relevant? Those are the sorts of things that help us understand what's the concept that you're going for here. What's the general trajectory of this project? And this also allows us to give some thumbnail dollar amounts, right? If you're installing a new mechanical system, that's going to be a significantly different dollar amount than if you're repairing an existing system, or if you're just doing controls upgrades. Those are both good, decent projects that cost a fair amount of money, but it is a level different than if you're installing an entirely new mechanical ventilation system. So this gives us some sense, if you don't already have bids for these projects, which you can also submit, this gives us some sense of the size of this thing, right? And that helps us understand as we're getting these intake forms in, how is this going to match up with our budget? That's really what we're trying to do here, is just get a rough sense of what are the dollars needed for this project. If you have already scoped these projects, you have bids, you know what the costs are, please submit those to us with this final question. If you have exact costs or anticipated, estimated costs, give us that number. That is super helpful for us. If you don't have that yet, that previous question where you're sort of choosing which things might be involved in this project, that is a really big help to us as well. I'm going to pause here and see if there are questions about the intake form. This is important, and I want to make sure, like for me, if we get to nothing else on my slide deck, but you all feel really confident going into this website and know how to navigate this intake form, that for me is a success. So I'm going to pause here, and if you can either put questions in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask. You can raise your hand. I see a hand up. So let's start with Neil and then Phil. Go ahead, Neil.
Hi. So my question revolves around essentially assessment.
Yep.
I know of a spot or two that is unventilated.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm more concerned with how do I know if a space is underventilated? I have not gone through the process of hiring a third-party contractor with monitoring, devices to tell me that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is there some process to get assistance from you or Efficiency Vermont or someone else to inform us of our deficiencies?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question, Neil. So I invite others of you who have gone through this process before and know what this entails, but I'll start. And then if there are others that want to chime in, that's super helpful as well. So I would say when you are thinking about your intake form, you definitely want to check off that you want an engineering assessment of the existing system. So we can help you figure out what the assessment might include. You know, we can help you work up a scope of work for procuring that assessment. But there are a number of your esteemed colleagues and peers here that have gone through that process before. So I wonder if there's someone who has gone through that process who'd be willing to comment specifically for Neil on how that has gone for them, and if there are particular sort of takeaways or tidbits or tips that you want to share with Neil. And I'm sure he's not the only one who has this question. And I can call on people because I know some of you pretty well. I'm looking at you, Bruce. Hi, Bruce.
Good morning. So I did have a question, just a clarification.
Sure.
And I'm afraid we might have already submitted our form.
That's okay.
And we probably submitted it with 75% or better ventilation. However, the ventilation's inadequate and isn't cutting it. So I'm going to send my superintendent an email, see if he's already submitted it. But if
Sure.
not, should I put that in the, like, it's probably only 50% efficient. So should I mark it as 50%?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great.
And Bruce, if I can pick your brain a little bit on Neil's behalf, have you had an assessment done on your HVAC systems? Can you provide some guidance to Neil and others who might be new to sort of doing that measurement and monitoring?
Yes. So I actually, for the first round that we did, I had Precision Test and Balance come in. I think they're in Essex, and they measured airflow on all of my HVAC systems and calculated air changes per hour in every location. And that will give you a really good picture of, how well the system's functioning. It may be, you may have a system that's sized correctly but hasn't been cleaned in 20 years, and not putting out the CFM that you need. Or you'll definitely find out whether or not, a motor's dead that nobody knew about and it's just not moving air.
Yep.
And so we did that, and that did generate a lot of, repairs, and also helped us to justify some of the projects that we did. But if they're too busy and you can't get to them, I mean, they're nice because they're licensed professionals who, you can definitely take their results and hand it to your board and say, this is what it is. But if you can't do that, the other thing we've done is we've got our own hood flow, airflow hood to use on, whatever ventilation system we want to test, and it'll measure, the CFM, and we got a nice enough one so it'll actually calculate the air changes in the room for you once you put the information in. And those are really useful.
Yeah,
Thank
great.
you for that,
Thanks. We tried a couple of different tools to do some testing on our own, not quite investing in buying an actual device that Precision might use, and we got some mixed results with that. Nothing I would want to take to my board and swear this is the number of air changes per hour. So hiring a company like Precision Testing and Balancing to come in and do it, I have 7 or 8 schools. That's a big undertaking in and of itself, and so some I guess grant money in order to do that would be lovely.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that is available, and certainly is a question of mine.
Yes. Yes, so
That
these
is,
assessments are eligible costs. We're going to get into sort of, there are some rules governing when you can incur those costs if you want them to be reimbursed by grant funds, but assessments are absolutely eligible costs. So let me talk a little bit about, for those of you that already received the email that we sent out on Tuesday, I'll draw your attention to the linked document in there called the grant information packet or the grant packet. There is information there, really detailed information about eligibility of costs. So labor, materials, energy assessments, architecture services, like all of those are eligible costs. Whatever you need to support an indoor air quality project, obviously with some technical guidance from us as needed, those are all eligible. We will work with you to understand what really is going to support the project in your buildings, but those assessments are absolutely eligible costs, Neil. Okay, I believe that Phil was the next question, next hand that came up. So Phil, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Good morning. So we already submitted the form, but
Yes.
I didn't add any data or any proposed, already quoted work. Can I resubmit the form, or how do I go about that?
Thank you for that question. I was actually thinking about that with Bruce's question too, where he sort of said it served a certain percentage of the building, but it actually didn't serve it well. So I think it makes sense to resubmit. I'm going to check in with my team after this to make sure I'm not totally making their lives really, really hectic. But I do think it makes sense that if you initially submitted information that you now realize needs to be presented differently, I want to give you the opportunity to do that, and we can cancel out. And I'm going to look at Melinda, just make sure that I'm not messing things up too badly. I think now is the time to correct it, right? We don't want to get down the road and have a building that needed to be prioritized not be prioritized for this initial round of funding because you didn't have the clarification that you're getting now. So yes, please resubmit. Bruce, clarifying question on that?
Well, no, a little different question. So if anybody's still on this vein, let's stick with it.
Okay, any other questions about how to answer? So Kevin, I see your hand up. And I see Allison.
Okay, so over the period of the last 2 years, all the recommendations that have come out for COVID and everything, I did have a company come in because we wanted to make sure that the chorus room and the band room had proper air exchanges.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm taking it to this grant program, even though we have a fully functional HVAC system.
Mm-hmm.
What I found is that because the system is 30 years old,
Mm-hmm.
Even though they had duct cleaning done, they never had the coils cleaned.
Mm-hmm.
And so we didn't have enough air exchange in these rooms.
Yep.
And the problem with it is a lot of these coils you don't have access to because you have to cut a door in order to get to the coil. And with the band room and the chorus room, we found out that the cafeteria had 10 times the air it needed, but it was only because the coils going into the other 2 rooms were plugged.
Mm-hmm.
Once we cleaned the coils, our airflow came back, so we had the air exchanges in the area. So this program is something, even though we have a fully functional system, but I know it's because of the coils.
That's right. That's right. And that kind of goes back to what Bruce was talking about with the testing and balancing. That is something that will actually absolutely be discovered when you do testing and balancing, that assessment of like measuring what the actual airflow is. And you're absolutely right, Kevin. If one place is plugged up, the air is going to go somewhere else, right? Yeah. It's got to go somewhere. The motor is pushing it to, right?
and we, well, I've only been here 10 years, but we have a very good, I change the filters at least 4 times a year. But I think what a lot of it is fine dust with the humidity in the summertime, and that's what plugs the coils up.
Sticks. It sticks. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, and then my other question was, when we fill out this form, because down to the SU, they're very busy, can the principal fill this out, or does it have to be the superintendent?
I think in general, what we want to see is that anything in the same supervisor unit or district comes in at once. That just helps us sort of think through like who we're communicating with. So I think it's absolutely fine for a principal, for you to give that information to the superintendent or anyone in the central office to submit. But it's important that the superintendent is aware and the business office is aware that all of these things are going in. That will become important when they submit things to Jill's team, because this is not the only this is not the only funding that is available to you all for doing projects in schools, construction projects in schools. And so it's really important for the central office to know, so that when they're submitting the application through the grant management system at AOE, that they have all of these projects in one place. So definitely coordinate to get that information to the central office. I would highly recommend that the superintendent or a person in their superintendent's office be the person that submits the information.
So necessarily doesn't have to be the superintendent. It can be the financial, you know, like the CFO.
Jill, would that be okay from your perspective?
So generally speaking, Kevin, for anything that's involving grant funding, it's the superintendent that needs to submit, because they are the person that signs off on assurances. Like, nobody else can do that, right? So oftentimes a business manager, a curriculum coordinator can input the information, but it's the soup that actually has to sign for it. So as best practice, if you can have your superintendent do the intake form, that is the best practice. Let's try and stick with that. But I don't want this to be like an absolute barrier. We can't get it in. So, you know, do your best to try to follow that practice. Once you actually get into sort of the next steps that Jody's talking about, that does have to be the superintendent that submits things. And then, Jody, if I can just jump in really quick, I just want to signal a couple things about ESSER.
Sure. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, because the questions are coming up. So one thing I just wanted to say is, if you have these kinds of like cleaning studies, you know, some of those like kind of maintenance level activities that will significantly improve your indoor air quality, but maybe are not like those sort of top line priority type projects that the legislature has sort of pointed these funds towards, right? Those are all ESSER eligible. And so this gets back to that thing that all of you hear me say on different meetings, that coordination between, say, the facilities managers that know what's happening on the ground and the business managers in the central office that know what funding is available is critical right now, because there are many strands of funding happening and you want to try to optimize it. And frankly, we're not used to having all these federal funds for this kind of these kinds of projects, right? It's always been like, oh, we got to find coins in the couch from our local funding to try to do this sort of deferred maintenance and that kind of thing. You have the opportunity right now to leverage those federal funds. So working with your business managers is critical here. And then the second thing I'll say is, this came up in the chat thread. Our teams working on the indoor air quality grant we're talking about here, and the ESSER teams, it's the same team. Like, it's, you know, it's me. So we're doing a lot of coordination. You have the ability to braid your ESSER and indoor air quality funds. It's why we created one process, right, that can accommodate multiple funds. You also, we were just talking about this with the Efficiency Vermont team yesterday. Let's say you had sort of begun the steps of a project using ESSER funding, and you followed all the requirements for ESSER funding. It's the same requirements for these funds by design. So if you now have an opportunity to try to apply for some indoor air quality funds instead, and you've already done ESSER, we have the ability to make those pivots, and we will help you through that process, right? So don't feel like, oh, we've started with ESSER, that disqualifies us from this. That's not the case. As long as you're following the requirements for ESSER, you are following the requirements for these funds, and therefore we should be able to pivot. So don't panic if you've already done that, and we'll help you through that process. That's all for now, Jody. Back to you.
Thanks, Jill.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I really appreciated those questions. So I believe that the next hand up was Phil. Before we get to Phil's question, I want to make sure there weren't any other clarifying lines along this particular thread about, you know, ESSER funds, all of those sorts of things.
Jody, there is one question. It might make sense just for Jill to clarify a little bit further, which is whether or not participating and submitting intake forms in this program compromise or conflict with ESSER. And I think what Jill is saying, it doesn't, because she's going to be looking at it comprehensively. But I just wanted to say that explicitly. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura.
And yeah, exactly. Thank you for reinforcing that. If you are following the ESSER requirements, you are following the same requirements for these funds. Therefore, we should be able to pivot. They do not disqualify each other. In fact, we encourage, you to look at braiding them. We encourage you to, go for these funds for their intended purpose and save your ESSER funds for student supports or whatever. So really think about maximizing the funds, and we can help with that if you need help with that.
Thanks, Jill. Okay, let's go to Phil.
No, Jody, I had already asked my question about the form, so I'm all good.
Got it. Okay, absolutely. That means I need to. There we go. Jonathan Garthwaite.
Yeah, good morning. My question is more of a process question and kind of a scheduling question. So we have a project in development that is kind of like cut and paste exactly what you're talking about. It's a very defined area for a special program with a complicated combination of really old equipment and new controls. It is interesting because it's a regional program, so it pulls in students from a bunch of districts. So it really seems like a good fit. However, I'm rolling, like we're moving at speed. I've already done the engineering assessment or had that done. I have a contract on my desk to sign like literally today to pay an engineering firm to develop the scope for bidding this summer and execution before the next heating season. Is that even a reasonable thing to expect we could roll into this?
Potentially. So, and we'll get into this in later slides if we get to them, but because we might not, I'll answer the details of your question now. Any costs that you've incurred prior to having approval from Efficiency Vermont and the Agency of Education aren't eligible for reimbursement through these funds, right? So if you've already submitted, if you've already incurred these costs, if you've already obligated through contracts, those would not be eligible. If the project that you're doing is going to be happening this fall and you've not purchased equipment or any of those sorts of things, and you want to submit those for potential reimbursement through grant funds, absolutely do that. That could absolutely be done. But anything that you've already committed to or already spent isn't eligible for reimbursement through these funds.
So I understand that. So, we've paid for the assessment. I'm going to go ahead and move forward with the bid documents because I need construction documents.
Sure.
And then the next step, obviously, is putting it out on the street to get pricing on this project.
Yep.
So that's the information I would submit. Basically, was the bid submissions that we receive.
Yes, that's right.
Because I can't. I don't want to get stuck in a situation where I'm waiting for funding approval. I have to get funding approval from somebody.
Yeah, I absolutely understand.
Whether we move money around here or get it from somewhere else.
Yeah, and I can't sit here and say that the project that you're scoping is guaranteed approval, right? And I know that you wouldn't expect me to. So you're absolutely right. If you have a process in place, I would not discourage you from continuing with that. But I think it's also really important that you submit that. And if there's an opportunity for us to help you with grant funding, we will.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
And Jody, I'll just add a little bit here. So we want to, there's certain gates for these federal funds, right? There's certain touch points where, because of the requirements of the federal funding source, there's certain points where the Agency of Education, both for this grant and for ESSER funds, we have to do a prior approval, right? The super red line in the sand, do not cross moment is the shovel in the ground, right? That's where we really run into the red lines with the federal requirements. Bidding is another place where it may make sense to just pause for a minute, because you could still potentially be eligible for ESSER funds there, Jonathan. So I just want to signal that. I would recommend taking a couple of days, right? It may be worthwhile to reach out to the, have your business manager reach out to the Agency of Education team and see if we can still keep you in that eligibility range before you kind of go too far down the road. And again, I'm going to say it again, this is why it's really critical that the facilities managers, y'all are really used to like keeping projects going, keeping that coordination with the business managers, because they know where those touch points are, and they'll say like, halt, we got to do some loops, you know, we got to jump through some hoops here to keep us eligible. And you want to try and keep your funding sources as flexible as possible, because ESSER does allow for those pre-award costs. So you can maybe make this an eligible cost under ESSER funds, whereas it wouldn't be under the indoor air quality. Right. So it's very complex right now. I would recommend, whatever your projects are, you know, sometimes maybe just like taking that extra few days, come back to the AOE team and let's see what we can do to help. And we're trying as best we can to not be a roadblock and a delay and keep those projects going, because we totally understand what's happening in the field. So that would be my one like caveat. Just maybe come back to us for a few days. Yeah.
And what I'll say is, as we're getting into some of these process details, I do cover sort of the general process in upcoming slides. So if the remaining folks that have their hands up, that's Frank, Bruce, and Al. If your questions are process related, let's pause. I'll go through the process slides. If your questions are intake form related, go ahead and unmute and ask your intake form related question.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? So the prioritization that you've got set up there of percentage of square footage and level of ventilation, do you have any flexibility in the looking at the description? Because we've got spaces that we want to make improvements, specifically the cafeteria at our high school, where on paper it's a very small percentage of our square footage, but at any given time a third of our population or half of our population may be in that room. Mm-hmm. Is that, we also have, it's also been engineered and cost estimated, you know, it's ready to go. Do you have the ability to look at that and go, that's a valuable project? Or is that the kind of thing you'll look at and say, well, we got to wait a month or two to see what bigger needs are coming down the pipe? And if you say to us, no, will we get some sense of where we stand? Because at some point we either have to move forward with it or say, well, if we wait until August, maybe we'll rise up on our list. How's that going to be taken care of?
Thank you for that question, Al. And I'm sure you're not the only person. That's the thing about those of us who are willing to put our hands up, right? We're asking questions that at least a half a dozen other people on the call have. So thank you for that. I would say that when you look at the intake form, there's a box that says scope. And so if you highlight in the sort of text box that you have a particular part of your building that is densely occupied and not adequately served, that's where we would look at that.
Okay.
Now, again, it might be that there are other buildings or systems that get prioritized. And so when I go through the process steps, I'll say this again, but our intention is to communicate regularly sort of where things stand. So I'll get into sort of what our, again, this is in theory, we haven't yet done this, so we're learning together here. But what we anticipate doing is looking at the intake forms on a monthly basis and having the priority folks identified, and we are starting to work with them. So, you know, it could very well be that the building that has the cafeteria that's not adequately served right now might not be in the first round, but I don't know because I haven't looked at all the intake forms yet. So just denote that in the text box on the intake form, and we will regularly be in touch with you to let you know kind of the status of the applications for the different buildings.
Do you think you'll be sending out a list that sort of gives us a sense of where we are on that list?
That's a good question. We hadn't contemplated doing that, but we could certainly talk about that. Would that be helpful to you?
Well, I mean, it keeps us, because if we're at the bottom of the list, or we'll make it next month, that would be helpful as to whether we're in. Another quick, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds. The notion of those engineering costs, those upfront costs, which are going to be 10% of our projects.
Yes.
When do we think, as those stand right now, if we've already done the work, we've already done the work.
Yes.
But is it concept approval that we can start holding those bills and allocating them, or is it final approval, or should we just anticipate we're only going to be it's going to be when we hit final approval and shovel ready, and so we kind of got to eat those engineering costs?
That's a great question, and I will definitely be getting to that in my next slides. Okay. Other questions on the intake form?
One other last thing, the one thing, and you talked about what we've done in the past. Is Efficiency Vermont still doing their retro commissioning services?
We are.
Because that's put our district in good stead. And when we hit the first round, we had reports that were 6 months old where you guys went in and did that. So
that's great.
It may be a little while. I don't know how quickly you're getting to it, but that's a good, cheap way of really understanding where your buildings are at for folks.
Agreed. And that can be something that maybe I put in an upcoming email, is just some of these experiences we're hearing about, the types of professionals that have been engaged that you have found very helpful. So Bruce talked about the testing and balancing. You're talking about the commissioning agents and their initial assessment. So those can be really helpful tips as folks get started. So I will definitely take your when can you start incurring costs question in a moment. Other questions on the intake form? I see that Frank and Sully have their hands up. So Frank.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah, Jody, I think this is it's part of the process question. That's why I was happy to wait. Okay. So should we, it's again about the engineering cost and the timing and whether we can break up a project. Sure.
Yeah, let's hold off on that. Thank you, Frank.
Okay.
And what about you, Sully?
Jody, that might be Ken Sullivan. I don't know how it's coming out on your screen, but
it's you, Ken.
Is that
Hi.
Me? Yeah, is that me? I know I logged in with a different email, but so I think it does have a lot to do with what they were talking about. My thing is if we do systems like testing and balancing, we try to incorporate that into any of this process or grant funding, will it slow us down and maybe inhibit our ability to actually get the next step process, which is, get the actual system approved? And then timeline 2024, obviously the faster we can have designs, testing and balancing, results, that kind of stuff done, we're going to run out of time even to get contractors. So yes. I'm just curious about the concern about that. If we were to take, say, and do designs on things under $10,000 or $9,999, and then submit them, would that expedite the process any?
Potentially. So I think what I hear in a couple of questions, sort of this theme of like, we want to get started, how is this timeline going to go? So let me step into the process as we envision it right now, and also know that if this isn't working, we need to tweak it, we will, right? Like, we're going to continue to get together just like we did before. You're going to let me know what's working and what's not working. I'd love to hear that feedback, because ultimately we get better at doing this by hearing about your experiences, right? That's the only reason I do my job, is to make your jobs a heck of a lot easier. That's my goal. So let me get into the process questions, Ken, and then if I didn't answer your question, come back on and let me know. Sound good?
Yeah, thanks.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna share my slide deck again, and I note that we're at 9:25. I am okay continuing to get through these because there are some specific questions that came up. But again, know that if you need to drop off, this recording will be available and the slides will be available. So you're able to get all of this if you're not able to stay on. But certainly you're welcome to. I will stay here as long as we need to make sure that your questions are answered at this point. So with that, let's go back to the process slides. Okay, so we've talked about the intake form. We did a nice long tour around the intake form and others. Thank you for your questions. Let's talk about, that's where we were just now, this concept of rule. I think this is where we're going to get into some of the questions that you're asking about, like, if I get engineering studies, is that going to delay my funding? So the reason that we're looking at the intake forms in these batches is that we're basically trying to say, okay, of the high priority buildings that need the most help, do we have a rough sense of what that help is going to cost? And we know sort of what we can approve up to a certain point. Once you get concept approval, we are not then going to say, well, now you can't get grant funding, down the road. Our goal is to sort of identify roughly how much this is going to cost at the very outset so that we can continue those approvals and pause them when we think, I think with what we've approved at concept so far is going to expend the full amount of funds, right? So if you are approved in concept approval, we anticipate that as long as your projects are eligible, right, if you are coming back to us with scopes and et cetera, that you will also get grant funding for those, right? So it's all sort of like, that's why we're trying to get a sense of what those costs are at the outset, because we want to approve as much as we can right at the outset. Just knowing sort of where, like, obviously there's a finite amount of money, so we do want some cost information at the outset as much as we can. So here's how that's going to go. You've submitted your intake form, we've reviewed it, we've contacted you and said, hey, this building is a high priority building. Let's talk about your concept. We'll get some technical information if we have questions about the scope that you submitted on the intake form. What we're going to do at Efficiency Vermont is once we all agree on the general scope, the trajectory of your project, we're going to say, yes, we approve this concept. This is like technically sound, it's feasible within the time frame, et cetera. It meets the requirements of the program and of the federal funding. With that concept approval letter that you get from your team at Efficiency Vermont, the superintendent then puts that in that grant management system, the federal construction application, along with probably a number of other requests for grant funds, right, through that federal money. That's why it's important that the superintendent's engaged at this point. So that concept approval letter from Efficiency Vermont is basically the supporting documentation that the agency needs to say, got it. Efficiency Vermont and the technical experts there that know a thing or two about HVAC systems and indoor air quality say that this is a good project, right? What is conceptualized here gets their stamp of approval, right? So then you get that approval from the Agency of Education. You come back to us at Efficiency Vermont. We write up a subgrant agreement. That is when you can start incurring costs for architecture and engineering services, right? If you are getting a commissioning agent to come do an assessment, if you're getting a testing and balancing person to come and do an assessment. Once you have that subgrant agreement, you are going to then be able to go into architecture and engineering services, right? So you can procure those professionals to come and do those studies, to come and help you write up plans. So if you incur these costs prior to having the official approval from this team, right, so from Efficiency Vermont and from the Agency of Education, if you incur costs before that, they are not eligible to be reimbursed by grant funds. So that's, like Jill said, like there's a line in the sand where we want to make sure that if you're incurring costs, if you're spending money and you're expecting it to be reimbursed by grant funds, that you have to go through this concept approval first, even if it's just engineering studies.
Jody, I'm gonna make it complicated. They're not eligible for this grant fund.
Got it.
They might be eligible for your ESSER funds.
Got
In
it.
fact,
so
they would
if
be
you've already done studies,
so sorry,
they might still be eligible for ESSER funds. That is where what Jill said before about having your business manager contact the Agency of Education to say, oh, we already did these engineering studies. Are we still within the realm of eligibility for ESSER funds? That is an avenue. If you want them to be reimbursed by IAQ grant funds, if this is sort of the track that you're on, they would need to be approved, and we would have to have a subgrant agreement, a contract in place in order for that to, in order for us to reimburse them with grant funds through the indoor air quality program.
And just to signal something here, there's precedent for this. We have seen this using ESSER funds on other projects, right? So we have seen districts who have said, okay, we don't know what we need, so we're not ready to do a full school construction application. We're going to go get a study done, right? And they go and they procure those services, and that just goes into their ESSER application, their ESSER grant application, right? So it's totally separate from the school construction application. It's just like a study, right? It goes into their ESSER grant application, we approve it. And then based on the results of that, they may develop a full facilities, construction plan that then, then they really need to come back into the school construction prior approval process. So very similarly, if you've already done some work here, and so you know exactly what you need, you can still come and apply for these indoor air quality funds. You're still going to have to do concept approval. You're just at a different stage of concept approval. Your concept approval may be very detailed because you know exactly what to do, or your concept approval may be sort of what Jody was describing before. We really think we need to do something here. Both of those will go onto the same track. So people can be at different stages of this process, and we will be able to get you onto the track. Go ahead, Jody.
Indeed. Okay, so with these assessments, regardless of how they're funded, please follow procurement rules for using the funds that you are hoping to use. We'll talk a little bit more about that in subsequent webinars, but that is important. And then any reports or resulting sort of recommendations, submit those to the Efficiency Vermont person that you're working with, and we will then start to move into what we call project approval. Similar process to concept approval, which is we work with you to finalize or refine the scope at this point. At this point, we should have, detailed recommendations, perhaps even equipment specs, costs, timeline, et cetera, right? This is really like, exactly what this project is going to look like, at least on paper. We will then issue, the Efficiency Vermont team will then issue you a project approval letter. Again, your central office, your superintendent, head of school, will go to the Agency of Education's grant management system and put this in their federal construction application as supporting documentation for grant funds through the Indoor Air Quality Grant Program. Once you get approval from the agency that, yes, indeed, everything looks good. If there are any amendments needed, right, if we didn't have a total understanding of the scope at concept, and as Jill just said, we might not in some instances and maybe many instances, we will refine that and amend that subgrant agreement to really capture everything that you're intending to do with the grant funds. So here's a line in the sand again. Equipment purchases or construction costs incurred prior to project approval will not be eligible for reimbursement by grant funds. This is very different than the previous program. So we want to keep reiterating that we want to be careful with your funds. We do not want you to spend funds that we can't reimburse if you were expecting us to. So that is really important. That is the line in the sand for sure. Okay. Finally, implementation. This is your bread and butter. We are getting the tools out. As Jill likes to say, we are swinging hammers. There is duct work happening. Someone's up on the roof. There's electrical work happening. Things are happening. So any approved purchase and construction costs may now be incurred. If there are changes, right, you open up the wall and you're like, well, I didn't expect to find that in the wall. Let us know, right? We know that once you start working on things, it's common for things to change. Maybe the piece of equipment that you thought was going to fit isn't going to fit. Maybe it's no longer available. Maybe the cost went up for the labor that you expected to hire. Whatever it is, whatever the changes are, just communicate that to us. And if we need to amend the subgrant agreement to capture that change in scope or a change in cost, we will do that. It's important that you maintain records and documentation. These are federal funds, and so we will have a checklist of things that we need to make sure that we collect to meet those requirements. So we will provide lots of detail about that before we get to that point, but just know that the maintenance of records and supporting documentation will be important. You'll be submitting those to us for all of the completed work. We do require a W-9 in order to issue payment to the payee. And again, this is slightly different from Efficiency Vermont's typical work. Some of you work with us, have worked with us on efficiency projects, and we are able to remit payment to your contractors in a third-party agreement. For these grant funds, we are not able to do that. So that is not permitted under the rules. So the payment needs to go directly to the legal entity at the school, so the supervisory union or the independent school. Okay. I'm going to quickly go through these next steps. I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to get to any other questions that those slides didn't address. The next step is work facilities and central office in collaboration to submit intake forms for one or both programs, either the monitoring program or the grant program or both. Someone asked about the deadline. So we will continue to accept intake forms forever, right? We don't expect the funding to last forever. So we are going to make our initial prioritization list in early April. So it's important that if you are interested in participating in either of these programs, that you submit intake forms to us by the end of this month. So that's about 2 weeks away. With those intake forms, the Efficiency Vermont team in early April will be reviewing all of those, looking at the information you provided to us on the intake form about the current condition of your mechanical ventilation, and be in touch with you about the status of your application. Either you're moving forward right away, something's not eligible, we'll let you know why, or you didn't make the prioritized list that month and we'll revisit the next month. So we will communicate all of that to you after we have that initial review sort of session in early April with the internal team. The last step is if you haven't attended a training that the Agency of Education put on for complying with the rules around the federal funding, I would encourage you to watch a recording and review those slides. We have access to those and I will certainly send them out again. And these are things that we're going to dig into in subsequent webinars. Again, just because compliance is a big deal when you're working with federal funds, we want to make sure that we're all set up for success here. And so we don't anticipate that we're going to be making any payments in the next month or two, so we have some time to work through these. But in the interim, I highly encourage you all. Thank you for sending those links. They're in the chat now. I encourage you all to revisit that information to make sure that you're sort of framing the work that you're thinking about doing with that lens in mind. Okay, we are at the end. I'm going to stop sharing. efficiencyvermont.com/schools is where you can get more information.
Jody,
but I
can help you run through the questions in the chat, and the first two I can help answer if needed. Does that sound good? Okay.
Thank you, Laura.
The first question is, I have a concept approval on an HVAC project through ESSER. I am interested in participating in the monitoring program related to my approved ESSER project. How should I connect the dots? And I think the answer to that is, Bruce, you can go ahead and submit the intake form. And when doing so, you would check the monitoring program box. If you are also interested in grant funding, you would check the grant program box. But if you just want to do the monitoring program, just check that box and submit the form.
Okay, yeah, because I've got concept approval on the project, so it would just be the monitoring. So I just check monitoring, right?
Yes, unless you're also interested in getting the IAQ grant funds for the project, in which case you would also check IAQ grant fund.
Yeah, I'm feeling like because I have concept approval
in ESSER,
I wouldn't need to check that box. Is that correct?
Is that right, Jody? I mean, potentially you could get grant funding though for the rest of the project, or no, you'll just use ESSER funds for that.
I think if you have concept approval through ESSER, then that's the way to go, Bruce. Because you're probably far enough down the path where that makes the most sense.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thanks. The next one is, are there demographics requirements within our student body that determine our school's eligibility for participation or levels of participation, as are the case with some of the federal CRF grants?
That's a great question. Thank you, Dexter. So in general, we know that the buildings where mechanical ventilation is a bigger issue tend to be in places in the state where the tax base is lower. There are fewer resources. You all probably don't have a ton of support getting grant funds, etc. So in terms of demographics, we are aware of those, but in terms of prioritization for this program, we are aware of geographic distribution of grants. We are aware of all of those things. But by and large, we're using the existing building conditions as our priority, as our first kind of priority of how to rank the grants that we're going to be awarding.
And on the monitoring program, demographics does come into play as required by the Department of Health. And those are the ones that are publicly available. So the next one is, I think this has been answered if we're
Yep.
bidding on a project. Okay, after that, we will be sharing the slides and notes after this call. Jody will send those around.
I think Elizabeth's next question was answered.
Okay.
Elizabeth, can you just, Elizabeth, if you're still here and we haven't answered the questions that you have in the chat, would you chime in either in the chat or go ahead and unmute and let us know that you still have a clarification needed? Okay.
And then I think the last question was from Dexter. Where does the check come from? Efficiency Vermont, or federal government?
So the check will come from Efficiency Vermont. That will be processed through our finance department. So it'll come on Efficiency Vermont letterhead or checker head. Okay. Bruce.
One other, I don't know, detail.
Sure.
So when I send out my RFP for professional services, architectural engineering, I can get an architect to use an engineer and all the other associated people as subcontractors to them. So really, can I just go out for architectural services to do my projects, and then the architect can determine what engineer they use and that and so forth?
Yes, I think as long as you're following the procurement guidelines for the federal rules, all of that is still fine. And Jill, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the reason I ask is because like the HVAC project is really an internal working and just a portion of what an architect would normally do.
Sure.
But there will be some architectural details associated with it where I'd want to have an architect stamp. So.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, great. That was my question.
Thanks, Bruce. And I see that Jill is curious if there are oh, go ahead, Jill. Did you have a response to that?
I was any independent schools on the call, because if there are, we'll have follow-up for you.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, there are.
Yeah, I saw a couple of names in the very beginning. So yeah, I know that we do have some independent schools. And yeah, before we wrap up, I will talk a little bit about that, because we know that independent schools in particular have less experience using federal funds. And so we want to make sure that we are sharing the trainings that the Agency of Education put together last year, and that we're really working through those details, because those of you that have less experience with this, I mean, we're all learning together as it is, but if you have less experience working with federal funds, we want to make sure that we're supporting you. I think that Frank put your hand up. Yes, Frank, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I think this is an easy question for probably Jill. If we already have concept approval for HVAC projects, and Efficiency Vermont through the intake process confirms that we have an eligible building, does that mean we've already got concept approval? Does the AOE concept approval transfer to Efficiency Vermont, or are they two different concept approvals?
Okay, so we're talking about basically the same project, and what we want to do is we want to switch the funding source, right?
In that, well, at this point, Jill, we've got concept approval for like 4 projects.
Yeah.
And we're like everybody else. We're in the middle of coordinating engineering services. But now this application is open. We're going to submit today. So that's the question. If Efficiency Vermont determines that we're in the priority group, is your concept approval, Jill, assumed to be granted at Efficiency Vermont, or is there another concept approval cycle?
So what we would need to do is you would need to do an amendment to your original concept approval, because you're substantively changing it by switching the funding source. But Frank, I don't want to freak you out. This should be a really light lift, right? Okay. So you go back into your concept approval, you do an amendment, you'd bring your Efficiency Vermont letter with you. There's a little upload button. you stick it in there and you change your budget to reflect that you now have a new funding source.
I see.
And that's pretty much it. And then we'll send you out a new, review it, meaning we'll make sure you've got your Efficiency Vermont letter, and we'll send you out a new concept approval letter, and it shouldn't slow you up. You should still be able to keep things moving. So we've tried to streamline that as much as possible. So consider it not a new application, but an amendment to your original.
I see.
Because you're changing the funding source.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of other hands still up. Let me see who we have here. Elizabeth.
Hi, this is just a follow-up to Frank's question and then Jill's answer with regards to switching the funding. So I as well have concept approval. I had it in my ESSER grant. But now if I go back and amend that concept approval, you mentioned the letter from Efficiency Vermont. So do we not amend that concept approval until we get the letter from Efficiency Vermont? So basically, I apply, like say today, for the intake forms with Efficiency Vermont, but then I'm going to wait for that letter to come through from them and then submit my amendment.
That's right.
Concept. Okay.
Yeah, and so, and Elizabeth and Frank, this applies to you as well. So you would actually have two amendments to do in GMS. One is you would amend your school construction application concept approval. And then two, you would amend your ESSER application and remove this essentially from your ESSER application.
Thank you for the clarifying question. Now I just
another question in the chat. Do you see that one?
Thank you. I was just lowering hands.
It says space temperature is one of 4 parameters for measuring air quality. Is replacement of a boiler along with vent motors, etc., eligible for cost?
Potentially, I think that if that's a part of the scope, here's what I'll say, and I talked about this a little bit in the facilities manager forum on Tuesday that Jill and I were in as well, and there is some work happening at the state level because they know that once you start bringing in more outside air in January, the heating system is going to get more taxed. So in the previous version of the program, we did include in a handful of projects some upgrades to the heating system as well to make sure that as the school building system was bringing in more winter air inside and moving it around, that their heating system was able to meet the increased need for heating, for space heating. So I would say that we are careful with these funds and heating system upgrades can also be quite expensive, but I don't want to lose sight that they are necessary. And so I think if you alert us in the scope that you put in the intake form or through our conversations, we will talk with the Agency of Education to understand where that might fit, or there might be some programs that the legislature is contemplating currently, knowing that this is coming, that these needs will be coming, that there might be some additional funding support specifically for heating systems that are necessitated really by the improvement in air quality. As you say, temperature is absolutely a component of air quality, and if we're bringing in -10 air on January 4th, we do not want kids and teachers and other building occupants to be wearing their scarves and mittens and coats. That is not a good indoor air quality or building occupant experience. So please include that in your scope, and we will absolutely figure out how and where that can fit.
Yes, and the first of those kind of like heating initiatives, if you're at the facilities manager meeting on Tuesday, Chris Hine, who is at another sister agency, they're in the development stage and will be rolling out fairly soon a kind of pilot renewable heating program for Title I eligible schools. It's a little pot of money, but it's meant to, I think, sort of inform some of the conversations that are happening in the legislature. So be cognizant of that. That also exists, just to add a little bit more complexity. You should be hearing more about that in the next month or so.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks for that question. It's a good one. I don't see any additional questions, and I am so grateful that those of you who attended were able to stay a little bit longer. Renee, I'll just comment quickly. The meeting on Tuesday, there was a facilities managers forum that is hosted by the Vermont Superintendents Association on a monthly basis. And there were a number of us panelists who are also panelists on at that meeting on Tuesday. So that's why we're referencing that. Some of you who are here were also there, and it is nice to see you twice in 1 week. That's just a treat.
And I believe we have a recording of that meeting as well, if people are interested.
And my slides from,
yes.
Yeah. Yep. Thanks, Bruce.
Great. Dexter, I was just about to say, Jody, is it okay if independent school folks stick around? Yeah, because this is a whole new world, to quote Aladdin. Sure. I have small children. This is cool. But yes, I would recommend, Bruce, I would put in a plug for folks to take a look at that recording. Because again, I am the bearer of complexity. That's what I do here. We also talked about PCB testing. Radon testing is out there in the universe, right? And it's like been sort of mum's the word, but that is a requirement that the legislature passed last time. So the more that you can think about how you sort of fold all these things together and not create, you know, we just ripped that wall out and put new drywall up, but now we've got to go do testing. So we have to, you know, rip it all out and do the whole thing again. Really recognizing like it's all very complex. We totally get it. And Jody and I and her awesome team at Efficiency Vermont are really, and the AOE team are really, really committed to try to streamline this as best as possible. We're super, super aware of the complexities that you all are juggling right now. So sometimes my brain just
yeah, I mean, the good news is, the silver lining is that one of the reasons why it's so complex is that there's a lot of financial support available, and it's our job to make it as easy as possible for you to access the funding you need to do all the things you're being asked to do. So we know it's a lot of work and it's at a time when you're probably short-staffed, and you know, the world is doing what the world does and not making things easier for us right now. But it's really our job to make it as easy as possible for you all to access the funds that are available. That's the reason that it's complex. We are here to make it as easy as possible.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that I love about having these forums is that there is a lot of shared knowledge that we bring together, right? Jill and I have our own knowledge about the stuff that we know, but you all bring so much to these conversations when you're sharing about like, how do I do this? Oh, I've had experience with that. Like that type of exchange is so valuable. And so to the extent that we can continue to create space for that, that is what these webinars are designed for. I can talk about process all day long, but frankly, I can also send you slides and you can read and let me know if you have questions. I think having those conversations and meaningful exchanges about what's working and what's not working is just really, really, I think a critical component to us all feeling like we're in this together. And that's what I want to make sure that we do, that we feel like we're in this together, because we are. I don't see any other additional questions. So I think what I'll do is, for those of you that are representing public schools, we will say our farewells. For those of you that are here representing independent schools, we welcome you to stay on for some additional information and conversation with Jill. And be on the lookout for email updates and ongoing communication. We'll set these up. I'm actually going out of town for a couple of weeks, so you won't be seeing me in a couple of weeks, but we'll set up another webinar soon. I'm visiting family in Oregon, which I'm really excited about. So yeah, absolutely. Travel is back on, right? It was really nice to see all of you public school folks. Some of you I haven't seen in a year, and it's just nice to see your faces and see your names on my screen again. And we'll be in touch again soon. Have a great rest of your day and a good weekend and couple of weeks.
Thank you, Jody and Jill.
Yeah, thanks.